Good question. It's a good question. Oh, one thing that I know my dean would like me to remind you guys. If you are close to completing a certificate, now it doesn't matter what certificate it is across the entire school, but if you're close to completing a certificate, like you're going to be completing the required elements this semester, or I think it's this semester, you have to apply for that certificate, and I believe there is a deadline that is readily approaching. So please make sure you go visit the Advanced Technology Division office, which is over in the Technology Building. There's a form you have to fill out that allows the school to do an audit on your academic records. They're going to go through and just double check to make sure you've completed all the courses that are associated with that certificate, and then at the completion of that of those courses, you will get your certificate in the mail, okay? So the certificate's not automatically kind of issued to you. You have to kind of apply for the certificate and go through the red tape, as they say. Jump through a couple hoops to get that document included in your academic records. Now, those are things you're absolutely going to want to achieve and absolutely want to include in your kind of academic portfolio of stuff. So make sure you start to work towards the completion of all of those degrees and certificates. Does anyone know what a certificate illustrates for a future employer or a future school? Yeah.
You know what? Actually, I don't have a specific answer. I was just going to say that if you have like an AA, it would be easier to get into an internship while you're in school.
And you're absolutely right, but what does it illustrate? Why? Why do I as an instructor encourage you guys to complete degrees and certificates? What does it give you?
Experience.
It gives you experience, absolutely. What else? Proficiency, yeah. And it demonstrates those skills and those proficiencies, right? To a future employer or to a four-year school, it proves that you are interested, committed, and an expert in these areas, okay? I had the very lovely opportunity to speak with a guy named Mark Otero, who is the CEO of what used to be Click Nation. Now it's Capital Games down here in Midtown. Very large video game maker here in Sacramento. And one of the things he mentioned during our conversation was what he looks for in employees. And he said, believe it or not, it's not software skills, because everyone's going to come at this from a different perspective when it comes to software, right? He's not looking for software skills. He is looking for proof. Because everyone that comes in front of him preaches at the top of their lungs that they are really passionate about making video games or 3D models or animations. And his response to every single future employee of that company is, prove it. Prove that you're interested in this. Prove to me that this is the one thing that you want to do in your life. Certificates and degrees are a part of that proof, okay? It shows that you have an interest that takes you the distance to complete something that could be, it's much more serious than a casual, experimentation in the course offerings.
So I just want to point out, I've talked to several people that work in the field, and pretty much what all of them have told me is that when an employer is looking at work, your degree is important. You have a degree, but they're more concerned with your portfolio than what school you went to.
Absolutely. It's part of that proof, right? They're just looking to see if this is something that you're really interested in. Because I could talk the talk, right? Anyone can go up and say, I worked on Star Wars, right? But you need to be able to prove your skill, prove your passion, show that you're talented, and show that you have a technical mastery over something that will add a value to whatever company it is that you're applying for, okay? That's what degrees and certificates give you. In one way of showing, and I mentioned this earlier, degrees and a certificate, those are a part of that proof. It's not the entirety. What's the large? That's 25% of the proof that you're interested in this. What is the lion's share? Your portfolio, right? Absolutely. Your portfolio is ultimately the demonstrative product that shows that you are dedicated, passionate, talented, and skilled in the areas of 3D modeling, animation, and game design. Okay, that's what you have to have. Okay, you got to have it. You got to have it. The projects that I've designed for this course are going to give you kind of a nice foundation and a good, kind of start for a much larger portfolio of professional illustrations of your talent. Okay, so take these projects seriously. These aren't just homework assignments. These are portfolio projects that you could then insert into a much larger collection at the end of your academic tenure. Okay? All right, let's get started. Oh, one thing to kind of keep on the radar. coming up. We're now in March, so I got to start promoting this and ensuring that you guys are aware of what's going on. The Game Developers Conference coming up. GDC Conf. Here we go. The Game Developers Conference, March 17th through the 21st, down at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. This is, you are allowed and encouraged to go to this, okay? Who knows what the Game Developers Conference is? Yeah, Elijah, hit me.
All the big companies talk about the new innovations they've made.
You got it. This is the game developers, kind of like prom, if you will. Everyone comes down to the Game Developers Conference. This is the one time in the entire calendar year where almost the entirety of our industry is at one place at one time, okay? It's amazing. You're going to want to go to this, okay? Or at the very least be aware of that it's happening that third week in March, 17th to 21st. There are two elements to the Game Developers Conference that you need to be aware of. First, there's the Trade Show Expo, which is a collection of all the software and hardware vendors in our industry showing the latest and greatest technology and tools that are coming out of their work studios, okay? This includes all the game makers as well. Aha, awesome. So you get to actually talk with the people who are making games. Part of the trade show is a career pavilion, and this is the one thing that you need to go to, okay? You actually get to talk to the person that's hiring, okay? You don't get, this is not just a random email. This is not just, you know, a website that you fill out online, you know, to apply for a job. You are talking to the human resources person. You're talking to the creative director who's going to be hiring maybe you for this opening within their crew, okay? This is an invaluable resource, and it's direct access to the people that are making the decisions, okay? In addition to doing on-site interviews and trying to find the talent for their games, they're also going to be doing a whole series of portfolio reviews. So if you want some critical feedback from someone that's other than me, and you do, okay, you absolutely want critical feedback from someone other than me, they're going to be looking at portfolios and giving you suggestions on where you've done things right and where you've done things that you need to improve upon, okay? So definitely check this out. You want to go to the Career Pavilion, okay? Yeah. I have not said what tickets cost. Which brings us, that's actually a nice segue into the other part of the Game Developers Conference, which is the actual conference itself. The conference consists of a whole series of lectures and talks and discussions and panels about the art of making games, okay? This is entirely designed for developers, okay? So you're not going to be working with, salesmen. They're not going to be telling you about, marketing numbers and all that jazz. They're going to be conferences and discussions that directly kind of broach the topics that we're discussing in this class and in 426 and in 420, okay? It can be quite expensive to go to the conference, okay? A lot of people, they get kind of sticker shock when they see how much the conference costs, and it is like over $1,000. It's not inexpensive in any shape or fashion. So that's probably not an option. It's not even an option for me. But the one day that you want to keep on your radar is the 21st, which is the Friday of that week. The 21st is Student Day, okay? You don't get access to the conference, but you do get access to a whole series of panels that directly talk about issues that are related to students, including, and this is an important one, portfolio development, okay? Because they take you through all the steps that you need to accomplish to create a really professional portfolio that will get you a job in this industry, okay? And there's a couple other things. Every year it changes, but they always do that portfolio talk, and it's invaluable. It really is. I believe tickets, in the past, tickets have been $75 for Student Day. It gets you access to a whole series of panels that are directly going to discuss the issues that are important for you guys. As well, you get access to the trade show floor, which is really kind of neat, and the Career Pavilion. So those are the three things you get on Student Day. I am planning on going down on Student Day, okay? Or I'm going to try to go down on Student Day. I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it. But I would encourage you guys to go. I really, really would. This only happens once a year, okay? This is a foot in the door. It really is, because you get to talk to a person, and that's kind of amazing, all right? So definitely keep this on your radar. Go check it out. Get all the website or all the information on the website. It's gdcconf.com. Check it out. You're going to want to go to this. Okay? Questions about Game Developers Conference. Coming up here soon, a couple weeks actually, 2 weeks from 2 weeks from today, actually. Okay, go check it out. All right. Let's get back into what we're going to be addressing and talking about today. There are a number of things that I want to go over. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so it looks to me like we're going to be doing, I had 2 questions about the conference. First one is, it looks like we're doing, what week are we going to do difference maps?
Bump maps, normal maps. Yeah, coming up here soon. Coming up here soon. Not today. We're not going to talk about that today at all, actually. Okay. This is one of those things where you have to set the foundation of skills first before we can jump into something more advanced. Okay. We really need to continue our conversation about creating diffuse texture maps and get into some specific tools and techniques that will allow us to increase the quality of our work before we can jump into something that requires a little bit more attention. Okay. We can't talk about bump maps and normal maps or the creation of normal maps until we're really, really comfortable creating our textures in Photoshop. I say we have now passed the toddler kind of experience stage of working in Photoshop. We're in like the preteen era for our Photoshop skills. We have quite a journey in front of us before we really can jump in and tackle something pretty advanced. Okay, so we're going to get there. I guarantee we are going to get there this semester. If you want to kind of get a jump start on that, there's a lot of resources online. If you do some investigation and some searching that describes the process of generating bump and normal maps, so it's out there. It's out there. Go check it out. All right. So this week we're going to start talking about painting in Photoshop, and we're going to talk about a number of new things that makes the creation of our textures a little bit more detailed. Okay. We're going to focus a lot this week on brushes inside of Photoshop. Last week and the week before, we started using a whole series of photographs and collecting them together in Photoshop, marrying them with a whole bunch of baked images that come directly out of Modo, and then kind of throwing them all together in the pot that is Photoshop. Well, this week we're going to add a new wrinkle into the mix, and we're going to start talking about the brush system. Because brushing, or being able to go in and paint details with our brushes, is really, really, really important. Okay? This is going to be a drum I'm going to beat over the next couple of weeks. It's definitely something that we can't overlook. It's a massive part of our production pipeline, so we're going to spend some cycles talking about it. Question?
This is actually, this is a question that's related both to this class and the 402. If you're doing 402 also, are we going to be texturing that model, or can we texture that model, the character model that we end up making, and put it in our final project?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Are we going to texture it for that class though?
No, not directly. Not directly. Absolutely, of course, of course. Okay, let's go ahead and continue talking about what we're going to be exploring this week. So we're going to talk a lot about brushes this week. We're going to talk about the process of going through and adding a lot of specific detail that will increase the quality of our final object. As you would imagine, this week is part 2 of our dumpster. Last week you spent a significant amount of time focusing on the construction of the model and the creation of the UVs. This week we're going to take all those UVs and create very detailed, custom Photoshop documents that will describe the diffuse texture object or the diffuse texture map of this object in ways that we have not really had the opportunity to discuss yet. It's going to be pretty great. So we're going to get super detailed this week on the quality of our textures. The great thing about working inside of Photoshop is that it allows us to create custom diffuse texture maps that allow us to put detail in very, very specific locations, okay? And that's the beauty of working within this pipeline. We're no longer working with these general projection types that kind of wrap our entire object with a blanket of images. We're going in and we're putting detail precisely where we want it. The brush system in Photoshop allows for us to very quickly go in and add this kind of detail without too much fuss and fuss, okay? All right, I want to show you some techniques and some ideas that will ultimately allow us to gain the type of detail that you're seeing in the successful examples that I've put on the blog post. Our lab assignment this week is going to be a really easy one, okay? Part of working in any sort of 3D capacity is having a reference library, an image library of really great reference images that you could use as part of your texturing process. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but it's going to be a real easy lab assignment. Yeah?
Quick question about the lab. Are we going to be turning in our texture library
Yes. Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about that as we get closer to the lab assignment. In addition, I've also collected a series of resources that I would like to encourage you to download and include in your personal library of assets. I've given you some really great grunge textures. I've also given you some really great Photoshop brushes that I would absolutely use as the starting point for your own library of stuff, if you will, that you can use in texturing. In addition, I've also created a whole series of videos that directly discuss the topics of detail painting in Photoshop. So if you need some, a small little refresher over a number of the elements that we talked about today, those, 8 or 9 videos will definitely get you going. Questions? That's kind of like the 10,000-yard description of what we're going on and doing today. Sound good? All right, let's hit it. So this week, I'm going to be walking through the entirety of our content using this really great kind of wall image or wall model that I made for a recent science fiction project as the foundation for a model. It looks pretty cool. I like it. This is definitely not a low polygon object, but the process of texturing a high polygon object and a low polygon object in Photoshop is identical. Okay, it's absolutely the same. This we know from our previous experience. This is absolutely not something that you'd want to throw into a game engine, because if you look at the wireframes here, yeah, it's pretty dense. It's all one piece. Okay, it's pretty awesome. I spent some time really going in and constructing a higher resolution object here. They'll give me some really neat results. Pretty proud of the detail. Okay, I love it. It's all one piece, which is kind of fun. And I did a relatively good job on it. I'm pretty pleased with it. In addition, whenever I model something, I always make the UVs. And this is what I ended up with the UV for the UV map for my object. Okay. Can I use these UVs in their current form over in Photoshop? Mr. Button, why not?
Well, parts of them are overlapping.
Parts of them are overlapping, right? And a number of you guys started to experience this last week, where you started to bake some elements from a number of your other models that you've been working on, and you're getting really weird shadows and things weren't coming out correctly. When we're using baked assets, like that ambient occlusion map, or that surface ID, or that alpha pass, everything needs to be separated out. The only parts of our model that we're allowed to have overlapping are parts of our model that we want to look texturally identical to each other. So for example, going back to our crate a couple weeks ago, if you want 2 panels on your crate to look identical, then it's okay to overlap those UV islands, because that same texture information is going to be applied to both polygons in our scene.
Did the same thing with a couple of hinges.
And it's cool.
All hinge.
Absolutely. I do it all the time. Overlap the UVs. That way, one bit of information is applied to everything within that's on top of each other. That's a good, efficient pipeline. But we just have to be aware of it. Okay? We just got to be aware. We kind of have to be the masters of our own destiny here. We are the operators of a very complex machine. So just be aware of what your UV islands look like. Sorry, Hannah. So I got some editing that I need to do here. How would you approach the problem that you see on the screen? What's the first thing that we should really look to size down? Because clearly some things are too big, they're out of position and proportion, but how do we approach this?
Select all the UVs and then resize them.
How would you do that? What tool would you use, Alan?
First, you have to select them.
First you got to select them, absolutely. Then after that, what would you do?
Use the resize tool.
The resize tool, just scale them down manually. Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great way of working. Could use fit UVs. Let's look at the difference between both of them. Okay, I'm just going to take all of these elements, and I have forgotten if I want to take. Excuse me for 1 minute here. As I turn some stuff off, I want to grab all these, and I'm just going to throw them in a new material called test. And inside of test, I'm going to apply one of our presets. Oops, that's the command history, Pat. There we go, preset library. There it is. I also want to make sure that on the image map itself in the shader tree, I'm directing it towards placing that image on the right UV map, and there it is. Now, if you look very carefully at the application of our UVs across the entirety of my mesh, things are looking pretty good, right? you have to test your UV creation and the placement and the size of all of your UV islands before you go any further, right? Why do I always put a checker image before I send it over to Photoshop? Why? Yeah.
To check for spots that don't work right.
Absolutely, to check for some really weird distortions, to check for areas in our map that don't match their other friends, okay? With an image whose features are very, very noticeably uniform, i.e. kind of this grid pattern, we can just very quickly just kind of scan down our model and kind of pinpoint the errors that are inside of our UV islands very quickly. So that's a big benefit. What other reason do we use? Or what other reason do we use these checker patterns? What else do we want to check? So we're looking for distortions, right? What else do we want to check? Yeah. Overlaps, absolutely. Areas within the mesh where we have some problems, and you can see those overlaps in the positive UV grid. What else? It also allows us to check the size and the scale of all of the associated UV islands to their friends within the scene. And this is an important one. If you look carefully inside of my UV map, I basically have 3 UV islands. I have the main body, which is this part. Okay, and I'll move it up. I have the main body, and then I have these kind of end caps, okay, that are separated pieces. And you can have separated pieces, and I would encourage you to do so as much as you can. Whenever you have a separated piece, what are you going to generate inside of your texture? What are you going to generate whenever you have separate UV islands on your model? A seam, absolutely. Are you going to be able to see these seams in the texture? Yes, absolutely. So we can't avoid seams. We're always going to be infusing seams into all of our projects, okay? So we need to be aware of the location of these seams and kind of intelligently designed where we want to have all these parts break together. Now, for the larger context of the application of this model, this is going to be a reusable part inside of a much larger three-dimensional scene. So I'm not really going to be focusing my audience's attention on the end caps, okay? Because there's going to be a whole bunch of these wall pieces that are kind of butted together, okay? I'm creating a reusable asset. Instead of modeling one mesh item that's got 80 of these things in here, I can make one single piece and then instance it, or use a replicator and a number of other pieces of technology to duplicate this element quickly within inside of my three-dimensional scene. Okay. Now, we need to make sure that the size of all 3 of these UV islands are proportionate to one another, right? Because I'm going to be reusing specific parts or specific textures over in Photoshop for the ends and on the sides, right? In my mind, this is going to be some sort of metallic object over in Photoshop when I'm done with it, right? The pattern of our metallic object needs to be the same, right? If we have different UV islands or different sized UV islands, that pattern is going to show up larger or smaller. If you look carefully at the way I've designed this, and I think I used this end as my kind of measuring stick. Yeah. If you look really carefully across all 3 of these UV islands, the grid squares give us a very specific understanding as to how far we need to go in associating the scale of each of our UV islands to each other, okay? So it's kind of like working with backdrop items, right? We get that one master image in there, and then we kind of call that one the master, and we lock it down, and we don't move it. And then we size all the other backdrop images within our scene to the master. I'm doing the exact same thing here, and I'm using that checker pattern to test the proportions of all of my islands.
So I had a question. If we're setting up like a high-res model and a low-res model to pull the ambient occlusion off the high-res, what would be the best way to do that? Do you set up the low poly and then make a UV of the low poly and then copy it?
Absolutely.
And then the UVs are already there?
Then the UVs are already there, because in order for us to extract texture information from a high res and apply it to a low res, that UV information needs to be identical. They need to be in the exact same spot. So all of our textures line up correctly.
Does that mean that it can't have any elements that are not on the low poly UV?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think that's probably the best way to describe it right now. You can add more things in there. For example, if I was to make a low poly version of this, it certainly wouldn't have the holes for those kind of recessed indents going along the length of my little wall panel here. Okay, that'd be something completely that wouldn't even be there.
Just to add to that, I've found that Moto does a better job of adding detail to your, if you start with low poly UVs and then go to a high poly. If you start deleting edge loops and things, going from a high to a low, and it starts freaking out and destroying everything.
Yeah. I would mirror that suggestion. I always start with the low poly, design that one first, UV map it first, and then up-res. Okay? You start adding in detail that you can then extract. It's definitely a whole lot easier. The workflow is easier. The results are going to be consistent. The results are going to be kind of well, you're going to be able to you're going to be able to expect something. Okay, the word is escaping my brain at the moment, but it's definitely something that I would encourage you to do. Start with a low poly, then go up to high res, and then do all your baking, just like I showed you guys on that crate a couple weeks ago. Okay. All right. Check it out. This is what we're ultimately trying to avoid. We don't want to have parts of our object that are larger or smaller than the others. Okay. If I had a really big end UV for that back cap on my wall, you can see that the texture, when mapped onto it, is going to be repeating at a much smaller scale. Okay, this is bad, right? If we were using one metal texture across the entirety of my little wall panel here, the detail of our metal would be smaller on the ends than on the base. This is bad. We want to have all the details kind of show up at the exact same size, scale, and proportion to each other. Okay, so they need to be in proportionate to each other, or as best we can. Of course, obviously, there are a lot of exceptions to this, but this is a good starting point for all models, okay? I kind of geek out with this as a lot, actually. Let me hit undo. All right. Oops. So how do we get all these UVs? Oh, and this checker pattern is a great way for us to test. It really is, because now I can just move that big base thing up and down vertically. Yeah, and this is what I'm after. I'm just trying to get a good sense if I'm close, and I'm really close. It's not perfect, but it's close enough for me. I think I'm generally pleased with it. Yeah, I think that's about where I need to be. I could get it a little bit more accurate if I wanted to, but for what we're doing today, I think the point has been made. All right, so the next thing that we got to do is ensure that all of these UV islands are scaled down into that positive UV quadrant at the exact same rate. Okay, not necessarily at the exact same time, but at the exact same scale rate, okay? Because we need to ensure that the proportions of all of these elements stay the same and that they are identical to one another. So let's check out a couple ways that we can do this. You're absolutely free to go in and scale them down manually. I think this was Alan's suggestion, and that's fine. This is a great way of doing it. I think there's absolutely something to be said about manually packing all of your UVs. I think that's really good. Okay, awesome, rock and roll, this is good. However, let me hit undo. I would also encourage you to look at pack UVs. It's right there inside of our toolbar, pack UVs. You click on this, you're gonna get this little option, this little popover that comes up. Now there's a couple things in here that we wanna look at, okay? It's gonna give us 3 different choices. It's gonna give us the option to pack, so it's gonna try to do its best to move all of these pieces around inside of our positive UV quadrant to get a result where everything fits. Okay, that's cool. Stretch. This is going to allow the computer to size and scale all of these things. Okay, and orient, which is going to tell the computer to automatically rotate it. Now, from time to time, I've learned that working with stretch turns into a problem. And I already have all of my pieces oriented the way that I want them. So let's see what we get. Let's hit OK. Packing it. And I'm trying to live stream and work with a very high-res model at the exact same time. And so I didn't get a great performance hit on that. But just visually looking at what we have here, yeah, things are good. I'm happy with this. The relative size of all the grid squares on my image map look to be almost the same. However, I don't like this. This is kind of driving me crazy. I don't like the fact that one end panel is on a different plane than the others. That just kind of drives me crazy. So I'm going to do something incredibly geeky and just kind of space them out. Something like that. There we go. I like it. I like it a lot. Ta-da! Question? Yeah.
When you pass UVs, is it always scaled correctly?
No. It doesn't always scale them correctly, and which is why I would encourage you to kind of experiment, test it out. I've learned from my experience with UV mapping, you kind of have to, be loosey-goosey on your expectations. Sometimes the tools do exactly what you want them to do. Other times, the conditions of your scene are going to tell the tools to do something weird and it might give you a funky result. So just experiment with it. I think having that image map, that checker pattern applied to your mesh gives you a point of reference as to how the tools are influencing your UVs, okay? Because I spent a significant amount of time extracting the UVs for this model. It was not as easy as one would imagine. There were some challenges, especially with all those little indents on here, that made the creation of these UVs not as one click as it often is in other situations. So I don't want to ruin my UV information. These checker patterns ensure that we're not messing something up. I think I probably spent maybe a good 30 minutes on these UVs. Don't want to have to do that again. I really don't want to have to do that again. Okay. Questions on this kind of idea in this strategy? Now remember, as 3D artists, you have to be like chess players, okay? You have to be thinking 8 or 9 steps down the sequence here to ensure that what we create here gives us opportunities in Photoshop. Okay, this is a good structure. Let's move on. Let's get this out of Photoshop, or out of Modo and into a format that Photoshop can accept. Export UVs to EPS. Put it right on my desktop, and I want to call this wall UVs. Go. And let's go ahead and set up our entire baking system that gives us the result that we want. Okay. I want to change my final color output to ambient occlusion. And I'm also going to add a new render output into the mix that gives us surface ID. Now, for this particular model, there's not a lot of surfaces in here that I need to control separately. But let's think creatively about the specification and the desired output, the desired outcome of my model. I want this to be a two-tone object. I want the base I want all these little indents to be kind of a silvery color, and then I want a majority of the base to be kind of maybe like an army green. Yeah?
I was just going to ask, when I was making my crates, I ran into a problem of my UVs, or not my UVs, my ambient occlusion on several of the Tuit crates where it was really dark, and I had to turn the opacity way down for it to work.
Interesting.
And then I had to edit it with white stuff in certain places because it was not showing the detail.
Interesting. I don't know. Without seeing it, it's kind of hard for me to tell you what's going on.
Okay.
But I'm sure it's not something we can't figure out. If you show me the file during our lab, I'd be more than happy to give you a hand.
For sure.
Okay, so before we leave Modo, let's talk about how we're going to be texturing this over in Photoshop. I mentioned that I want all those crazy little indents and the recessed edges inside my model to be kind of a silvery color, or let's just call it this. I want a primary color and a secondary color. Okay, so with that said, if you look at my UV map, man, that is just gobbledygook over there in my UV island. It's because of the density of all the edge segments on my model. It's very, very difficult for me to discern within inside of this craziness where all these features are. Okay, and I certainly don't want to have to go in and select things in Photoshop. So my surface ID and ambient occlusion passes inside of Modo are critical in this particular stage. So let's just kind of get that going here. I'm going to create the surface ID. Here it is. And let's go in and define which areas I want to be primary and which areas I want to be secondary. Now, I think for me, it's easier to select all the secondary stuff first. So let's just grab that loop. I'll shift up arrow, and then I'll just call this secondary. Secondary, awesome. I want to get rid of all these other materials. They're secondary. Now I want all of this jazz in here to be secondary. Doodle-doo-doodle-doo-doo. I won't do all of these because it's kind of like watching paint dry. And I think you probably still understand the concept from the last time we did this. Shift up arrow, hit the M key. This is going to be secondary as well. And I would do that for all of these pieces in here. I'm not too concerned about these little holes, okay? Because they're going to be in shadow, so you're really not going to see them very much. However, I do want to go in and just ensure that I've gotten all of the other little pieces in here. Just make sure I got what I want. Yeah, all of this jazz. I'm going to use, I'm holding down the control key here and just deselecting the parts of the model that I don't want to work with. Shift up arrow, that's going to be, oops, that's going to be secondary. All right. Do these simultaneously. There we go. Dun, da, da, da. One thing, I don't see people using selections enough, over in the lab. As much you can, use selections to really aid in the texturing pipeline, okay? It makes things go a whole lot faster. Trust me, it really, really does. All right, let me just grab these guys over here, and we'll call it a day. Now, if I was an intelligent person, I would have turned symmetry on, because this is totally a symmetrical model. So I could have been doing both sides simultaneously, but that's okay. My wife will still love me. Tell you what, I spent some time in Maya over the weekend doing some professional work, and boy, I think a lot of people take for granted the selection system inside of Moto. It really is far superior to most things. Oh, on that note, did you guys hear the sad news today coming out of the computer graphics industry? Softimage finally took the last bullet to the head, which is unfortunate. Autodesk is putting it to sleep, which is very, very, very unfortunate and sad. Softimage. Softimage is an old program. It's been around since the early days of the computer graphics industry. It had some of the best animation and simulation tools on the market. And Autodesk acquired Softimage from from Avid. It's called XSI Softimage. That's the full name of the application. It used to be owned by a company called Avid. And they purchased it from Avid, probably 6-7 years ago now. And they've been just kind of sitting on it. They really haven't been developing all the technology. And they announced today that the 2015 version of Softimage is going to be the final version. And they're sunsetting that entire application and development team, which is very, very unfortunate. Soft image. Yeah.
Why would you buy a product if you're immediately going to be
Well, and I think that's why they made the announcement now. To ensure that someone doesn't buy it and be surprised within a year's time that they're no longer going to be supporting this application and scuttling the development of the app. So, I think it's nice that they gave us at least a year. Yeah. And it gives people who are currently locked into a Softimage production pipeline to find alternatives into, like Moto, for example. I think the Moto guys are going to grow in popularity and install base as a lot of people from Softimage find alternatives that are not specifically related to what Autodesk is offering. Okay. All right, so let me show you something here, and this is kind of going back to what I was mentioning earlier about the power of selections. I've gone ahead and selected a whole series of polygons. I've made them kind of this pinkish purple, and I've applied them to the secondary material group in my shader tree. Now I need to select the inverse of all of these. I want to turn everything else applied to a separate one. How could I do this quickly? Yeah. we have to start with the selection first. And Andrew, you are absolutely right. The bracket key is going to invert the selection. But I need to go back and select some polygons. Eli.
Can I just use the material button?
Bingo, absolutely. A lot of folks forget this, that we have a selection set that's designed for materials, okay? So right next to polygons is this guy. So I can go in, and now I can select polygons based on their material. Now this is what you get. Something like this, okay? Do I have a polygon selected right now? I had it, there we go. Do I have polygons selected right now? No. How do I convert one selection type into another? Yeah, it's the option key. Okay, the moment you hit on the option key, check it out. All of your selection sets change to include this cool convert kind of method. And I'm going to convert to polygons, so I'll click on my polygonals. Boom, and there it is. Now, I've selected all the polygons that are associated with that material. And here's Mr. Andrew's next step. Hit the open bracket key, and it'll invert that selection. Okay? Aha, there we go. And I'll apply this to primary, new material. There we go. And I'll just visually make it a different color. It doesn't matter what. All right. Okay, now we're ready to start baking. All right, so a couple things. Walk me through the baking process inside of Modo. I want to extract ambient occlusion, surface ID, and alpha output for all the UV information that I have in my scene. Walk me through it.
Go to your render tree, select your right click the back and change whatever you want it to be.
You got it? On the actual render outputs, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
If you're doing the AO, you go to your render tab and change the frame size, whatever you want the picture sheet to be.
And that's what we want to focus on. This is the step that people often overlook, is that the baking engine inside of Modo is entirely dependent on the frame size of our render camera. Okay? So we got to go into our render options and change the frame size of our camera. And let's see. I don't want it to be 256. I'll just do 1024, not 1023, 1024 by 1024. And I'm ready to go. Because now, oops. Absolutely. Absolutely. If you increase the occlusion rays, the quality of your ambient occlusion render output is going to be a whole lot better. I'll leave it at 64 just for brevity's sake. I usually crank it, to be honest with you, whenever I'm baking something for a professional project. I want butter smooth ambient occlusion, so I usually crank the value. And when I say crank it, I usually mean around 256. I historically don't go higher than 256 because you're not going to see the benefit of going higher than that value in most objects. And then I just go grab a cup of coffee, I check my email on a different computer, and just let it bake for 5 minutes, okay? If you're lucky, you're only going to bake this stuff once, okay? So put the investment in. Yeah?
The 256 is what, color depth?
No, it's the number of occlusion rays that are being calculated to generate the ambient occlusion pass. All right, now that I've set up my entire scene, I'm ready to start baking, man. So let me just go select my item, make sure that its corresponding UV map is selected, rock and roll, and it is. And now, bake to render outputs. We're on our way. All right, and there it is. And it did all three of them simultaneously. Here's the alpha, looking good. And then here's the surface ID, also looking good. Yeah?
What did you do again? Make it do all three at once?
Nothing. It does all three of them automatically at once.
If you have the three items in your render window.
Yeah, and I think specifically, make sure that if you want to kind of filter which ones it does, turn the visibility of those render icons or render items off. Because it's basically taking any sort of visible render output in your shader tree, these three guys right here, and it's using that when I hit bake. Yeah? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great suggestion and a great tip. Often, in certain situations, we're going to want to change our UV bake border size. And if you're getting really weird results, go into your Moto preferences, and down here under, where is it? Rendering. Oh, there it is. Under final rendering, look at this UV bake border size. Mine's set to 0. You might want to experiment with this either at 0 or at 1. Okay, this is going to extend the baking area within inside of your scene by 1 or 2 additional pixels based on whatever value this is. If you're getting a really funky result, this is what you want to check out. All right, so let's save it. Oops. Excuse me, hit cancel. I'm going to do a save layered image. That way all 3 of my rendered baked images get saved at once in a Photoshop document. And this is going to be, let's just call this wall baked assets. I'll put it right on my desktop. All right, and let's go over to Moto and have some fun. Or into Photoshop, I apologize. Okay, now that we're over here in Photoshop, let's just import in all the assets and start working with them. All right, so there's that guy. And let me go grab my wall UVs. Now, whenever you open up an EPS file inside of Photoshop, the first thing that it's going to ask you to do is to rasterize, right? At what image size or resolution do we want to rasterize this image? Yeah, you got it. So let's zoom in. We'll go to pixels here, and we'll change this to 1024 by 1024. What color space do we want to work in? RGB, you got it. Let's hit OK. All right. Now we have 2 images or 2 Photoshop documents that are identical in size. One has, one has all of our rasterized UVs. The other has all of our render outputs. I'm going to take the UV layer one and just shift drag it into that other open Photoshop document to combine all of them. And let's continue working here. All right, let's be good stewards of our scene. UVs. There we go. All right. And the first thing you do is save out a new version. I cannot emphasize this enough. Save a new version. Now, I'm a little bit of a naming convention super nerd. I know that in the larger context of all production pipelines, you're going to be working with thousands, and I mean thousands of files. So having a series of naming conventions that helps you kind of decode the role of all these files, in my opinion, is absolutely critical. Okay, on every production that I've ever worked on, the naming conventions has always, or an established naming convention has always helped me find the assets that I need to work with quickly. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do, and this is a system that's worked very well for me in the past. I'm going to create a naming convention for my file name that gives me a little bit more information as to what this thing is all about. I'm creating a diffuse texture map for this object. Okay. This Photoshop document, its sole purpose is going to be the diffuse texture map for the wall. Whenever I'm naming something, I try to start my file name with the most general description of that object as I can. In this case, my project is called wall. After the first underscore, I get a little bit more specific. And actually, I jumped the gun here, because the next level of specificity that we need to work with here is TX for texture. So not only this is associated with the wall, okay, the wall project file. This is the texture file for the wall. Well, which texture file is it? Well, it's the diffuse texture map, okay? Starting from the most general and going to the most specific kind of description of the role of this file inside of our production pipeline. I'm also a big advocate of version numbers, okay? I love version numbers because you will have different versions of this project as it goes through its natural life cycle on your project. What's the one version name or number that you're not allowed to use? 0. Okay. Yeah, I would. Sure, 0 is definitely, okay, so there's two things you're not allowed to use. 0, because you never have 0. But what's, yeah? You can have 2? I've had project files that have over 100 versions in it. Final. You're never allowed to put the word final on anything, okay? Because here's what will happen, and this has happened to me, and I certainly know it's happened to you guys because I've seen how you're naming your projects as you turn them in, right? You put final in there, and then after the fact, like the next day, you go back in and fix something, right? And then what do? It's final version 2. And then turns into final version 3, right? We don't want that. We don't. No, that's bad. Boo. Okay. Boo, boo, boo. Nothing is named final inside of our media management system. Just use version numbers. I know from just the way I work that the file that has the highest version number is the most current version number. Okay. If there's a subtle little difference, you can also go in, or a subtle little difference between the files. You know, we have an additional sorting system here that allows you to put some I don't know, something else. Like this is just rough, okay? So if you wanted to have a version 1, you can put in the file name after the number rough. And then in version 2, you can also put maybe getting closer or something. Little notes just for your own personal edification to keep you kind of alerted to your own thought process as you go through this. Okay. All right, that's good. I like this. All right. So real quickly, before we take a break, let's describe the setup process of our entire texture, because before we can start really going in and applying all these really custom brushes and these really awesome detail alphas and stuff, we got to make sure that what we have is usable and is workable. So let's define real quickly all the different elements inside of our texture that we need to kind of zero in on. Now earlier in the big specification of this project, one of the things that we talked about having was a primary color and a secondary color. I want to be able to mask these two areas within inside of my models with a layer mask, right? I want to separate them from the rest of the pack. Setting up your texture first and testing this separation of your Photoshop elements, I find is actually really crucial. Because I don't want to spend a lot of time only to find that the texture file has a major problem in it. Okay. So thus enter the role of your Surface ID. Okay, your Surface ID is really, really important. I find it kind of the most critical part of this entire process because it allows us to very, very quickly go in and use the color elements here as the impetus for a selection, because that's all we're trying to do. And actually, I'm going to go in. I don't want all this stuff. I want to separate those out. That's okay. So this is the first image, or the first selection that I have here. And I'm going to apply that as a layer mask for a folder. Okay? Love it. So we've gone over this before, but let's keep cruising here. I'm going to select all the red pixels now. Looking good. Hold down Shift, grab these guys. Awesome. And create a folder and use that selection as a layer mask, oops, for that folder. Looks like I got a little sloppy here. So let me just deselect what I have and re-magic wand it. Here's a kind of a cool trick. If you find working with the Photoshop tools to be incredibly annoying and you would like a more specific cursor, hit the caps lock key, okay, and it will change your cursor from the magic wand icon into a little kind of little rectangle. Okay, I find that a little bit easier for me in my brain to understand specifically what I'm selecting and what I'm adding into my Photoshop selection. There we go. Now I can apply that selection as a layer mask for our group. Awesome. Then last but certainly not least, let me just select these two elements over here. Add, create a folder, and then mask that folder with my selection. I'm done. I'm done with my Surface ID. It's no longer needed. You can actually get rid of it at this point. Because remember, the whole purpose of Surface ID is to generate a selection quickly for us and accurately. All right. I'm going to go in and just very quickly. Yeah, go ahead. Question.
Is there a way that, so with the Surface ID maps, I found that my maps didn't get the selection all the way quite to the edge. Do you just expand the
just expand it. Yeah, just expand it. Yeah, and that's actually, you're going to see that in action here in about one step, for sure. For sure. That happens quite frequently. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. For each one of these folders, I'm going to put a solid color layer inside of that folder because I want to test to make sure that there are no gaps or seams in any one of these elements before I really go in and start committing myself to the fine detail brushing that we're about to do. So here is my texture setup kind of linchpin, okay? Solid colors. I use solid colors all over the place in Photoshop. They're going to be a big, big component of what we do here in a minute. So let me explore how we can create a solid color layer and its role inside the much larger perspective. You can create solids inside of this button right down over here, and I apologize, getting cut off. It's the yin and the yang symbol down in your layers palette. That's going to allow you to create a whole series of things, but one of which is going to be a solid color. I like working with solid colors because what they give me, there it is, the first one on top of the list. What they give me is an entire layer whose color I get to adjust at any time, okay? We're flooding the entire contents, in this case, of my folder with this light blue color, okay? It's flooding everything. And then we get to control which parts of the image that we want to adjust by its associated layer mask, which is going to come back and haunt us here in a minute, okay? This is important. It floods everything, and then we get to turn which parts of the image we want that color to go to with its corresponding image mask. So I'm going to just create a whole series of solid colors, and I'm picking random colors here. It's just I'm trying to get an idea if things are working. The great thing about solid colors is that I can always go in after the fact and change the color that they're creating. Just pick a green color. I almost always do this with very bright, solid primary colors. That way it's very easy for me to see if there are big issues inside of my Photoshop document. Okay. What are we going to do with our ambient occlusion render output? Yes, sir?
You want to change the blending mode to multiply?
You got it. Absolutely. Let's do it real fast. Let's multiply. There it is. And now we're overlaying all that lovely shadow information on top of all the layers that we have below. And you can already start to see some of the issues that are popping out. There's some gaps in here that we need to address, but we'll talk about that momentarily. Okay? Oh, come on. It's not that bad, guys, huh? Okay. Are we allowed to have, or let me take a step back. Where is this black background coming from? Yeah.
That's coming from the alpha output. It's coming from the background of the ambient.
Absolutely. Do we want that black background? No, absolutely not. We want to get rid of it. Or at the very least, we want to be able to control its visibility. Thus enter the role of that alpha output. Now here's my master trick on how to use these alpha outputs as a layer mask for our entire object. Put them, deactivate everything but the alpha output, or at the very least, have that alpha output as the topmost element inside your layers palette. Then you can navigate over to your channels tab and use the color information of your alpha output as the generation element for a selection. Inside your Channels tab, you can hold down the Command key and click on any one of these thumbnails and load those pixel values, those black and white pixel values, as a selection. You only get to do this inside the Channels tab. There we go. I'll just Command click on it, and you can see instantly it's selected all the pixels that are associated with your alpha output. Rock and roll. This is what we want. Because now I can go back over to my ambient occlusion pass inside my layers palette and use that selection as the genesis of a layer mask. Whoops, go away, Doc. Which is that guy right there. Boom. All right, let's turn off my alpha output, and I'm rock and roll. I'm ready to go. Okay? Okay. Questions so far? All right. Here's what I would recommend that you do next. And we went over this last week, and it's to test the setup of all of these textures before you go any further. Just make sure that what you've created is going to work. I'm going to use a PNG. I'll keep it right here on my desktop. There we go. And I'll just do none compression. so I don't lose any image quality. Then I'll go back over into Modo and apply that image. I'll apply that image into my scene. Now I can get rid of some of these materials. I don't need them anymore. They were just being used for the render output. So let's load an image on my desktop. It's wall. There it is. Let's load it in. All right. Now from this, we can see that we have some problems in here. Some of these problems are created by me.